Alright, now that we have our thumbnail set up and we've selected the thumbnail, it's time to set up our image. You can see I've got my mechanical pencil already prepared with my ruler, and put out my ruler just in case. And you can see we've already discussed that how we got to this point, our thumbnails, and selecting the thumbnail that we want. I'm kind of going over the ideas to kind of get a sense of the perspective placed on it. Now I know it's a 2-point perspective grid that I'm going to be working on, so I'm going to draw out a line for the horizon. As discussed in Set the Action, the horizon is basically the furthest point in which your eye can see on any given plane. So we're already creating the illusion of a viewpoint or an eye level. Let's decide that this is an eye level shot, even though it would be an eye level shot from the height of air, I would imagine. I'm also throwing out lines from what are going to be my established vanishing points in this scene. Now, if you notice, I haven't really done the blocking for the shot yet. And it's because I want to keep my options open as to how best to block this image out after I get it pretty much set up in terms of the actual squares and cubes that I'm going to use to represent most of these buildings. Then I'll block out the space in which the scene is supposed to take place. Make the panel surrounding it. Throwing lines down, setting up my vanishing points, setting up the rest of my lines, and see they're intercutting into one another. Basically creating a grid. Now all a grid is basically setting up the illusion of how things meet in a three-dimensional plane. While you're drawing a two-dimensional one, you're just basically creating your space. You can see it almost looks like squared off version of like the Matrix intro almost, or like Tron. But all it is just kind of an idea of how best to represent the floor and the footing that you're going to be putting for these buildings to work. Be afraid to throw as many lines as you need. It's probably going to be a couple even underneath the line. Even though if you look at the shot, it doesn't take the entirety of this space. You have to keep in mind that when you're doing perspective and when you're doing your own grids, it's going to probably be a vanishing point outside of the image itself. You're going to be drawing something that's basically capturing a spot that you're looking at, not necessarily the whole of the vanishing point. This is to avoid those weird bends that happen in the corner of some illustrations. You can see I'm drawing underneath the line just to make sure that I can actually draw the image in full and it makes complete sense. It also takes into account the difference between the perspective on top of the horizon and below it to imitate the vanishing points and the eye level. Lots of lines. I go over a couple more pieces, drawing even more lines out. You want to make sure that your grid is pretty well set up. And then from there, you start measuring out essentially where you want certain pieces to go, how to set up the blocks that you're going to be illustrating within this grid. You start throwing your lines down, start throwing them. Most everything starts off as basic shapes. That's the way we understand the world. Even as a baby, That's the first thing we did, was play with blocks and like cubes and very simple things, because the first thing we understand is the iconography of basic shapes. We see buildings, we see giant blocks. So when we illustrate them, that's how we start. We start off with giant blocks, throwing lines down and basically getting a sense of how the building itself is going to work. Now, because of the lines we've already thrown down for your vanishing points and for your perspective grid, you already know a lot about where it is that you can block off certain things, and it makes things a lot easier for you. Move things around. It also helps you visualize your blocking pretty quickly. You can see it's still setting up the rest of my grid all the way through. Don't be afraid of the eraser either. Just go in. The grid's there to help you, but it's not there to correct anything, so just go in, fix, redraw. Now already with the little lines that we've drawn out, we already got a sense of distance, foreground, middle ground. You get a sense of like where buildings are, or at the very least where our first two buildings are. And it can match a little bit our grid structure already. The horizon basically keeps us honest in terms of how the full image is going to work. Throwing lines down towards it and actually get a sense of where our space is. Now we move on to the third building in the image. Able to actually throw out a line right here. Start setting up the third location of our buildings. Actually be able to block it out and clearly make it very clear that we're actually putting it down. And you can see that we're getting more of a sense of the space that we need in our illustration. Now, the idea is that the building's actually super huge. You have to also remember the fact that all these images that you're drawing, it's a shot. You have to create the illusion that the shot continues beyond the image. So sometimes you draw over. You draw over the size of what it is that's expected from you, simply because when you cut off the sides and when you clean up your corners, it'll feel like there's more building beyond what you've actually drawn. So you get a nice sense of the space throughout. It's important to have effective equipment and the proper tools for any job. Normally, a bigger ruler could also help you out here because of the space allotted and the size of the work that I'm doing. This ruler pretty much works just fine. If I was working on 11 by 17, I might use, like, for example, a T-square or just a larger ruler, but this one works pretty well for what we're doing here. And also sometimes it's beneficial to work with smaller rulers and edges, only because if, for example, if you're working in comics, the panels themselves will dictate the size of the equipment, and sometimes having a full ginormous ruler in there might actually get in the way of you actually doing the proper lines that you need to do. Sometimes you have to adapt the material you have for the work you want to do. Now, as you can see, here is my grid. here's the blocking for this piece. And from this point on, what we're going to be doing later on is we're going to start adding a little bit more of a sense of distance. So hopefully that'll start working in there. And in future steps, we'll get to actually present our image fully. This concludes this section of our presentation. There's more to come, so please join us in the next chapter and continue working on this background.